Hi, I'm Tom Hendrickson from the DevOps Online Summit. Today we are joined by Eoin Woods, the CTO of Endava and the co-author of Continuous Architecture in Practice. Eoin, introduce yourself to the people here at the DevOps Online Summit.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for the invitation. Good to be here. I'm Eoin Woods. I'm CTO of a company called Endava. We build solutions for other people, very often sort of digital platforms, about 8,000 of us now. I've been there about 6.5 years. I oversee our capability, so I make sure we've got the right skills in the right places and we're doing things the right way. And before that, I spent about 10 years in the capital markets building big applications, and before that, about 15 years in the software product industry building products.
So it sounds like, Eoin, you've got some experience in the industry and you probably maybe have some bumps and bruises to go along with that.
Yeah, plenty of them, really. I mean, that's I suppose, years and years ago when I got into software architecture, because I was sort of thrown headfirst into having to develop systems as opposed to programs, and you suddenly realize that you're working at a different scale and there's a whole different set of things you need to worry about. But yes, I've helped to operate production systems. I've had at least my fair share of being on incident bridges when systems have failed. I've handled quite significant escalations from product, or certainly been involved in big escalations from customers of critical software products. So yeah, I've had my problems as well as my successes.
Yes. Well, that kind of leads us into our next question about, tell us why you wrote the Continuous Architecture in Practice.
So it's quite a long story, but I'll make it as short as I can. So back in the mid-2000s, actually, I wrote my first book on software architecture with my good friend Nick Rosansky. We did a second edition. That book, we've been very lucky. It's been very successful. We've sold a lot of it. And Nick and I were actually thinking about another writing project. But what happened more recently was that Murat and PM, my co-authors on this book, they had written a book on continuous architecture. And when I read it, I suddenly realized it was probably the book that I would have suggested to Nick that we wrote. So writing it again made no sense. So I just forgot about it. But as it happens, I knew Murat already, got to know him. He mentioned they wanted to write a second edition. For various reasons, they couldn't write a second edition out of the gate. So they decided to write a new book, a sort of follow-on. And they realized that perhaps this one was going to have a different flavor. And the first one was very much sort of, I'd characterize it as it's how to go about architecture. It just assumes you know what to do, but you want to change the way you do it. And a lot of people commented to them that was a good book, but really they a bit more on how to do it. So they thought, let's write the how to do it book, which is why this one's called In Practice. There's a lot more architecture information in this one. How do you make a system resilient? Those kind of questions. I knew Murat already. I talked to them about how they might go about this. I introduced them to a different publisher as it happens, and it was just, I started off volunteering to write one chapter, I think, then it became 2 before I knew I was a co-author. So that's kind of the story. It's the second book from Murat and Pierre, and I'm lucky enough that I happened to be standing by and was invited to pitch in with it and write some of the chapters.
Yeah, so they kind of brought you in slowly, and you're all a co-author now, and helped them with completing the whole book.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. The classic trick, yeah.
Interesting how that works.
And then get them to write a third of the book.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So, this is the DevOps Online Summit, but we kind of have to deal with software architecture a lot. So tell us kind of, how has that role of the software architect changed? Because I think that's something that's gone through a lot of changes over the years.
Oh, it certainly has. And that's why I think this book that's why I was keen to get involved. It's a really timely book, and it's quite important, actually. Maybe not this particular book, but the theme. Software architecture has gone from being, when I started, something where it was very much about making sure that some big fundamental upfront decisions were made correctly, that sort of overall structure of the system was finalized, nailed in place, and that everyone knew how to follow that and not mess it up. And there are systems today that actually are developed that way, and it's absolutely correct. If you're building an avionics system, you're going to be much closer to that than the way, say, Google build the search engine, which is highly iterative and learning as they go. You just can't do that with an avionics system. So wouldn't like to pretend that this is sort of for every system, but there is a class of systems today where actually we don't know a lot up front. All we know is we're going to build, say, a digital platform for retail logistics. Beyond that, we don't know what's going to be successful, which bits of it will work really well, which bits of it actually, when we get it into the market, we find nobody really cares about. So there's a lot less known up front. So the other thing is that years ago we used to build a lot more of the structure of the system. You remember, I'm sure, we used to sort of start with some libraries and an operating system, and we used to build everything in layers.
Yeah.
Now we've just got so many building blocks that actually, although there are things we need to decide fairly early, there's a lot less sort of absolutely crucial decisions that if you get them wrong, you're dead. There's so much more malleability in how we build systems because we can use other people's components. So all this has meant that rather than being that, let's do all this heavy thinking up front and then hand down the tablets of stone, as I used to joke about them, actually we need to move to making architecture decisions right through a life cycle. A guy called Elcho Port, he's a distinguished architect, I think, at CGI, the huge systems integrator. I mean, he started having these thoughts at least 10 years ago, and Jan Bosch, the academic, 15 years ago, probably Jan pointed out to the community, architecture is about the decisions, not the boxes. And so it's kind of grown from there, where now I think it's actually quite important that architects do work in that way. And it's sort of been a continuum from it's all about structure, it's decided once, it's handed down, to today. Actually, there's not a lot handed over at the beginning, and we just stay engaged the whole time, viewing the architecture process as a stream of decisions made just in time, or hopefully not just too late.
So it sounds like that as you mentioned, Eoin, that we started out in a fashion where we were giving this, and now it's almost like the architect or the people, maybe it's a DevOps engineer or a developer that's part of that team, has to be cognizant of those principles, like you go over in the book, all the time on all of our decisions, that we kind of evolves a more iterative process.
Yeah, exactly. We have to understand what characteristics our system has to have. So, for example, some systems, I mean, I've worked on some systems with our clients where security is absolutely, the most important thing, and they're prepared to trade many other things, performance, usability, maybe scalability for certain kinds of security. Other systems I've worked on, security, yes, I mean, you need some security, but honestly, if we don't get the throughput, there's no point building the system. So you really have to understand what qualities you're aiming for. And then people people doing DevOps engineering, people who are doing software development, people who are doing testing, they just know what the trade-offs that everyone's got to be living are. Of course, that's the great thing about DevOps, because it brings the cross-functional team idea, which has always been the sort of slightly theoretical idea. It really brings it to life, because everyone's got the same objective. Everyone's sharing information. You have a shared culture. You're using shared tools. Then hopefully that cross-functional team gels, and it's not so much an architect handing things over. There's a team of people who understand the architecture and evolve it together. I always say that it's a bit like I say about testers. Testers are not there to do the testing. Testers are there to make sure the testing is done. I think it's the same there for architects, and their job has changed. They're not there to do the architecture. Everyone's contributing to it, but they are there to make sure that good architecture is done.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And I think too, like you mentioned, I think in this DevOps era, we need to think about like things like when we have to balance speed and security, that we kind of need to know what are important for our application. Because like you mentioned, you've worked in, contexts of, a financial institution or something like that, where that's going to be different. If we're, an internet company like Google, we have different requirements, so that's probably the context where that context matters, right, Eoin?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very much about the constraints, the goals, the business context you're in the broad sense. I mean, a startup. I mean, I always say this to our engineers because we stress, DevOps is about sustainable delivery. Therefore, it's got to have a high level of quality to be sustainable. I'm always reminding people, quality does depend on the environment you're in. If you're developing a payment system for governments to do high volume critical payments in their country, that's one kind of quality. If you're a startup that's rapidly running out of money and needs to create a compelling app to attract consumers, yeah, it's also quality, but it's a different kind of quality. There'll be different trade-offs you'll make.
Yeah, good point. So Eoin, as we look out, and what kind of advice would you give to the DevOps engineers out there, and as they approach their work?
That's a great question. Well, of course, I'm not a DevOps engineer, so they'll have to filter my answer through that context. I mean, I work with DevOps engineers; they're terrific. I mean, there's a couple of things actually about the people who are sort of tagged as DevOps engineers, which I sometimes feel it's a bit of a hospital pass, that one, because DevOps is such a big field, and suddenly it all becomes their problem if you're not very careful. But I'd say for people starting out, be aware that DevOps is not just about the tools and the automation. DevOps is actually about a philosophy about how we work. It's the calms principles. It's about creating flow, and you're there as an enabler for that. And probably when you're starting out, you are going to focus on the technology. That's what people will train you in. But always be thinking ahead and aspiring to be thinking about how do I influence the people to work in a DevOps way? Because that's actually what's going to bring the magic, not the tools. And I think probably the other thing is what we were talking about is bear in mind why you're creating the automation. You're creating it to create flow, to create a system with a certain set of characteristics. And you've got a really key role to play there that often people won't explain to you. You'll have to figure it out for yourself, or you'll have to go to people and kind of drag it out of them. But always bear that in the back of your mind is, what are the priorities here? What are we really trying to achieve? Therefore, what part is my automation playing in getting us to that goal? Because that prevents the automation sometimes being seen as a bit of a science project on the side that's kind of cool, but no one's quite sure why it's happening. It just becomes central to achieving the overall shared goal.
Yeah, that understanding is so important. So, Eoin, thank you so much. Any closing thoughts?
Just really that, I believe in Darvel, we're big believers in DevOps. We really do think that DevOps meeting agility is where the industry needs to get to, not as a sort of future-looking idealistic thing, which is the way many organizations seem to view it today, but actually as the way that we deliver systems in many domains, not every domain, but many domains for the future of the industry. So the events like Online Summit are so important because we've just got to keep spreading the message and reiterating it.
Excellent. Thank you, Eoin, for coming on.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for the invitation. It was nice to be here.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. On behalf of Eoin Woods, I am Tom Hendrickson for the DevOps Online Summit.